Woiak History Festival. And if you haven't, you weren't here last 2 weeks ago, you might have missed our new display. And these are just some random photographs of some of the programs that have been produced in the last 15 years. And we think that's pretty wonderful, but you know, the success of it is that you guys keep coming, and it's a lot of familiar faces I see here tonight, and thank you for continuing to support the Tony Woiak History Festival. I want to ask your help with something. The two last programs in this winter session, we had to reverse the order of. So all the posters that went up around town are going to get a little sticker on them that changes. But Karen had some of these as you came through the door. If you want one to remind yourself, you can pick one up. But I would ask you then to share that news with someone else. So it's going to be the same two programs, it's just that they're not in the same order. And in case we don't want to disappoint somebody that specifically wanted to see one or the other. So this is the best we can do. So thank you for that. And let's see, what else do we need to say? That's it. Well, I need to tell you that this program, again, was started in conjunction with two local history groups of the Washburn Heritage Association and the Washburn Museum. And the museum people have been in a group much longer than we have, but this is the one kind of thing that we get to do together. And the concept was a local historian, Bob Macris, said, wouldn't it be great to have a winter history festival? And he spoke to both organizations, and we said, yeah, let's see what happens. And so it was a pretty good thing, I think. And so we thank Bob for his idea, and we thank you for thinking that our local history is important. And the other thing, we want to always remember to thank the Harbor Table. They have not increased the price for renting this room in all those years, and they do all the setup of the chairs, and get all the gear, the screen out for us, and the little tables are right where they need to be every week, and we really appreciate that. So even if you don't stop and get a drink at the bar or something, if you happen to see somebody that looks like they work here and you just want to say thank you, I think that would be appreciated. With that, let me introduce, did I forget something? Oh yeah, well, I think you guys probably, all these familiar faces should know the routine about the orange cones at the front of the room, and that's to prevent you from stepping forward at the end in case you've got one more really important question that you want to ask Sheree. She instead is going to carefully step forward and meet you here, because there are a lot of wires that run back and forth, and we've got things that we don't want to fall on anybody's head. And so, yes, if you'll remember to do that, that would be great. All right, Sheree Peterson, local historian. She lives in Bayfield with her husband, not George.
Phil.
And she is associated with the Bayfield County Historical Group, right?
Right.
And she has got a story to tell about the schoolhouses, the local schools, and I think that I'm just going to let her go ahead and begin, because I want her to have as much time as she needs. So please welcome Sheree Peterson.
Thank you so much for coming out tonight, because it certainly is cold out there. But as we've talked about, winter is the time for storytelling up in this area. It has been for hundreds of years now. And I'd also like to thank the two organizations who put on this history festival. I certainly knew Tony, and he was a real treasure, and what a great tribute to him to have this festival go on. For some of you who don't know about me, I've worked in local history here for 48 years, including 10 years working at Madeline Island Museum for the Wisconsin Historical Society. And tonight we're going to take a look at the story of early public schools here in the Washburn area. And the material that I'm presenting tonight came out of a project of the Bayfield County Historical Society, which is a consortium of 9 different local historical societies around the county. And the subject of schools is always appealing to everybody because everybody can relate. We all went to school and, you know, we were young, we might have good memories or bad memories, but it's popular. And we've always worked on stories about the schools in Bayfield County and written articles for our newsletter over the years. But we knew there were a lot of schools and there were a lot of good stories, and we're way up north, which kind of affects some of the things that happen at schools. And we really wanted to do a complete documentation of all of our schools. But time was flying by, and the group of us who were interested in doing this were getting a little bit old, and we decided, okay, we're forming a committee, we're setting goals, and we're going to get this done. And so we went at it systematically, and we had a great time. It was a great group of people, good sense of humor, everybody had different skills. And we came up with about 170 schools throughout the county that operated at one time or another. And we met, and we pretty much completed our book during the COVID years. We met some by Zoom meetings, sometimes in person with masks, but we did it. But it was a huge project, and we produced this book called Shaping the Future. And we got a lot of donations to help keep the cost down so we could donate it to local libraries and schools and sell it for a very reasonable price, and I do have a couple more copies with me here tonight. It's also available at the Northern Great Lakes Visitor Center store. So in this book, we wanted to be sure to find the location of all the schools, figure out how many existed, the dates of operations, the name of the teachers, what the buildings looked like, the communities that they served, and tell some of the stories behind these. And in the end, it turned out to be even just a bigger story than that. It's really the story of how our county was settled, why people went where they did, and about their children and about these schools, and what's happened since then. So we're going to go back in time a little bit before this was even, part of the United States here. We know this is an area where there are a lot of Native American people traditionally living. Been significantly the Ojibwe people who have been here, probably about 500 years. And in early times, because we're right along the lake shore here, people traveled by water in canoe. It was easier than, going through the marshes and the woods a lot of the time. And when Europeans finally came into this area, they also traveled by water and started a trade with Native people for furs that lasted about 300 years. Well, finally, this area started to become part of the United States, and when the Northwest Ordinance created the Northwest Territory in 1787, this was part of it. And in the Northwest Ordinance, it calls for people living in this area to be encouraged to be educated here. And the earliest Western type of schools that were started up in this area were actually out on Madeline Island and down at Bad River. And they were started by missionaries mostly who were under contract to the U.S. government is a part of U.S. Indian policy, which we know was not a pretty thing, but to turn Native kids into white kids and have them change their ways. But in 1848, and I wanted to mention too, learning is such a different thing in Native cultures compared to Western civilization. Ojibwe kids would learn how to go about their lives, to do and know the things they needed to, by learning from their elders, from sitting in the winter and telling stories around the fire, learning their histories. And so being in a room, reading, writing, arithmetic was a very, very different thing. So in 1848, this became the state of Wisconsin, and the new Constitution called for free public education for everybody who lived here. And 7 years later, 1855, the Sioux Locks were opened at the east end of Lake Superior, and suddenly ships from the lower Great Lakes could come straight on up into Lake Superior, which allowed passengers and freight to come straight on up. And it really opened up settlement of this area. And settlement now is looking at being on the mainland, not on the islands, because people were looking to railroads coming to connect this area to the rest of the country, and roads. And in 1866, the area that today is Bayfield County was set off from LaPointe County and renamed Bayfield County. And as people moved into the area, at first it operated under one government. It was all under the town of Bayfield. As time went on and more people moved in, they wanted more local government, so smaller towns were set off. This map is about, in the 1880s, you've got 4 towns there. Town of Bayfield at the top, and town of Washburn, town of Mason, and then town of Drummond down here. But more and more towns were set off over time. So people started coming here. I think I missed one here. Logging and lumbering was the first big industry that really took off here as the virgin forests were cut over. Railroads started to come through the area. In 1862, the Homestead Act opened up land to people who wanted to settle. They just had to prove up their land and build on it and take care of it a little bit. Land companies bought cut-over lands from the logging companies, and excess land from the railroads to sell to settlers. And they marketed it even in the languages of some of the immigrants who were going to come here, especially to Scandinavian folks, because this is a whole lot like the places those people lived, and they didn't mind winter, and it looked like a great thing to them. But those people wanted good schools for their children because they knew to get ahead, they wanted their children educated. And these are ads from some of the land companies that operated here, and right in them, they're advertising, there's good schools here. They also told people the farming was great. Well, in some places it was great, in some places it was pitiful, and there were a lot of stumps from cutting down all those trees. So as people moved in and settled, schools were built wherever children were living, because in those early times you didn't have good transportation. Most kids had to walk to their school, and it was generally thought the kids probably shouldn't walk more than 2 miles to a school. So there were schools all over the place, and kids walked to them, they rode their horses, they had dog sleds, and they skied to school. And over time, about 170 operated here. And as these local governments sprang up, those are all the towns there now in the county in the different colors. Each town was in charge of its own schools and administering them, and they had different sub-districts too. And when we talk about these early schools, we're talking about rural schools. They're also called district schools. There are 2 kinds. One is the ungraded schools, and those are the typical one-room schools where grades 1 through 8 were taught all together in one room, and they're the ones that are remembered so fondly by everyone. And a little bigger school was a graded school, and it usually had more than one room, and usually just two. It would have two teachers. One teacher taught grades 1 to 4 in the primary department, and another taught grades 5 through 8 in a grammar department. And the person in charge of all of these schools was the Bayfield County Superintendent of Schools. And their office, after the county seat was moved here to Washburn, was here in the courthouse. This person had a huge job. They gave teacher exams, they issued teaching certificates, they set classroom standards, they provided teacher training, and worked with all the teachers' groups that would form all over the county. And the woman here is Jessie N. Smith, who was legendary because she was the county superintendent of schools for 30 years. And she was formidable. But people said she was fair and she was thorough, and the teachers learned a lot from her. But one of the things she had to do every year was go visit every school to see what was going on. And some of these schools were in the boondocks. So Jessie went by foot, train. She took a boat out to the Sand Island School. She skied and snowshoed. She took horse-drawn vehicles and later the early motorized ones, and had to visit these schools. And the records from her office are in our collection at the Bayfield County Historical Society, and they just offered a wealth of information for putting together a history of all of our schools. So they included things like lists of teachers, teachers' records books from the classrooms, photographs, and all sorts of things. So it was really a wonderful lot of information that we could use. And another source of information is a lot of ephemera that exists out there. This is from 1915, the Sutherland school down by Mason, and just lists the kids who went there and teacher and who was on the board there, and whoops, let's go back. And there's Jessie Smith, the superintendent. We also used a lot of maps, especially early plat maps, and these were really helpful because if we look up here, there's a rail line running up through here. There's a little community called Edith along that line. Well, it's really hard to come up with information about Edith if you don't even know where it is. So these maps were helpful with that. And most of the maps had a symbol for a school location, either a square like this labeled or a little school symbol here. And it also shows who owned the land around the school, the families that lived there. So that's really helpful too. Newspapers were also a great source of information. We found an article here that told the complete story about a fire down in the Barnes area in a home where the teacher boarded, and teacher Elsie Meisner died along with family members when that home burned down. And sometimes it was just a 2-sentence reference in a newspaper that gave us proof that a school existed or exactly where it was. So they were really important. Another great source we used, especially when we were having trouble finding things, was this series of aerial photographs. They were taken of the entire state in 1938-39, which is basically right after cutover. So a lot of things on the landscape are very visible. You can see old trails like this in clearings. Here's a little farmstead. If it had like an orchard, there might be a little grid pattern here of trees. And you can also tell from these the original route of some of our roads, because over time, many have been straightened out as they've been improved. And you can also see small trails that kids took from their homes to the schools. So the county's LIDAR maps, which are online, and these are really cool because they show the surface of the earth and they pick up any kind of shape or depression. And from those, you can actually see old railroad grades, because they moved small gauge logging tracks here all the time to get into different areas, take out wood, and then they'd move the track somewhere else. And when you get on those LIDAR maps, you can see all kinds of things. So we were able to find sawmills and all sorts of features by using those LIDAR maps. So first we'll take a look at the first schools right here in the community of Washburn. And I forgot to mention, there's another kind of a school system that wasn't administered by the county superintendent of schools, and that's the city school system. When Washburn and Bayfield were big enough to incorporate, Washburn in 1904, Bayfield in 1913, they adopted a city school system which they oversaw. So all the other schools were considered rural and looked out for by the county superintendent of schools. So of course, when Washburn first started out, it had some pretty tiny schools here. So in 1883, we were looking at the Chicago, St. Paul, Minneapolis, and Omaha Railroad came up from the bottom of the county, was going to go through Washburn and all the way to Bayfield. So the Bay Land and Improvement Company in 1883 was selling lots along the shoreline here in anticipation of the arrival of the train. And the town grew quickly once that railroad came, because you had port connections here, you had the railroad, and things really spread out along the shoreline there. On that lower end, which was now called the West End or Benderville, is where the three big sawmills were. And up at the East End was the railroad depot and a lot of commercial businesses. And the area grew really quickly. And then in the fall of 1892, Washburn became the county seat, which brought more people here. So there were a lot of kids here right away, and they needed schools. So the first school up here in the East End was down here on Omaha Street, very near the depot. And it was a rented room in the bottom of a two-story building. Kids 1 through 8 were taught there by a very young woman named Mary Nelson. And the second floor was a boarding house. And the door that the kids went in was right under the platform that led into the boarding house. So the kids were always getting dumped on by food scraps and dishwater when they went to school there. And that one lasted just a few months. And then they rented the Congregational Church for another few months for those first students. And then down in the West End, the Benderville kids needed a school, so they rented a very small building for them, and the first class was like 26 kids. But more kids were coming. Town was growing really quickly. So in the fall of 1885, Pioneer School was built up on the East End, and it was located right where the courthouse is now in that big square. It was 2 stories, wood frame, and it had 4 classrooms. 2 teachers were hired initially, but in another couple years they had added a 3rd one right away. But they still needed more room, and they needed it quickly. So a meeting was held in 1888 in the community to discuss the situation with the schools. There were 275 school-age kids in the community at that time. The existing schools could only accommodate 172. 340 children were expected in the coming year. So the primary department was so crowded at Pioneer School that children were taught half-time in shifts. So if you can imagine trying to plan your school system when things are growing that quickly. So the town voted to borrow $7,000 from the state trust fund to build a new school in the West End and replace that little tiny school there. And the new building was called Lincoln School, and it was also called West End School a lot. It had 4 classrooms, and it was also decided at that meeting to add high school studies at Pioneer School. And it was out of the high schools that started in Washburn and in Bayfield that a lot of the young rural school teachers would come out of. And they would get hired to these one-room schools right out of high school. And they often went to a very remote place. They might go to a community where a lot of people did not even speak English. They might board with a foreign family, eat foods that they had never seen before. Some of them loved it, and some of them, it was a horrible experience, but can you imagine what that must have been like? So in the fall of 1890, Washburn had 410 students. There was still never enough space, and so they often rented spaces to hold classes. And to complicate things, Lincoln School was demolished by fire, and they had to rebuild it really quickly. And when Washburn got the county seat, part of the deal was that they had to provide a place for the new courthouse. So they moved Pioneer School across the street so that the new courthouse could be built on that square where it is today. If I don't drop these papers, it will be a miracle. So in 1894, Walker School was built in the community out on Washington Avenue, so kind of in the middle there. And it housed the high school classes and the primary grades. And it was named after Peter T. Walker, who was manager of the Bigelow Sawmill. And then finally in 1903, Garfield School there was built on the West End, and it was right on Highway 13. So when Washburn incorporated as a city in 1904, it had 4 operating school buildings: Pioneer, Lincoln, Garfield, and Walker, and then operated under the city system, and we'll leave that story there. In the meantime, out in the Netherlands, in the town of Washburn, the more rural section, people were also settling very quickly, and schools were built for them. And when you take a look at this, so the city, of course, is right over here. That's a lot of schools, and they aren't very far apart from each other. Each one of these is a square mile. It's just a ton of schools. But people wanted land. A lot of these immigrants especially could not buy land where they had come from, and that was why they were here. They wanted to start small farms. So we'll start out, we're going to talk about some of the schools down in this area: Three Switch and Progress and Wilson, Long Lake School, and Maple Hill here. And before we do that too, we're going to just talk about school buildings. In the 1880s here, a lot of the schools, and around the state too, were built in these rural places, and they were log buildings because the people who settled there could get the logs easily. Many of them, especially Finnish settlers, really were great log builders, and they built lovely dovetailed structures. And these are some in Bayfield County here. But the problem with log buildings is they're really dark inside, and there was no electricity. Kids had to see what they're doing in that school. They also weren't very versatile, and it was really hard to put in features like windows and doors in those buildings. So the second generation of school buildings were wood frame buildings. And they were pretty simple, but most of them had a bank of windows on one side that shone a lot of light to the wall on the opposite side where the blackboards were and the teachers sat. So there was good lighting. They've all got a wood stove in them for heat. Sometimes they had an attached wood shed, which was nice. Then you didn't have to run out in the winter to get more wood. A lot of schools would add a covered entry porch, which, I mean, in weather like this, wouldn't that be nice? But it seems like money must have been tighter in Washburn because most of the schools didn't have any additions like that. So. Oh, and the other thing I'll mention too about the schools, at first they were painted red with an affordable paint that had a lot of iron oxide in it, which gave rise to the phrase, you know, Little Red Schoolhouse. And then later on, they were painted white with a lead-based paint. That's what most of ours were painted white here. And as time went on, too, the layout of these schools was kind of standardized, and this was a building plan that was distributed throughout the state in about 1910 that gave some good directions on, you know, features you should have in your schoolhouse. Because in Wisconsin, they wanted all kids to have the same quality schools. So here, the window next to the door here, they're kind of high up the wall so that you could hang coats and things on the other side, inside there. There was that, whoops, sorry about that. That bank of windows here and across the blackboard teacher's desk. There's our attached wood shed out on the back side. They were a huge improvement, and a lot of our schools were built along that plan. So the first one that was built in the town of Washburn here was three-switch school, and it is a little wood frame building, but it is a really cute building. I love that style. We never had very many of them in Bayfield County, but it's got that great little bell tower on it. Three-switch was built out on Nevers Road on a parcel of land purchased from Walter Brown. And schools were often located on a 1-acre parcel that was bought up from someone's homestead, and often on a corner. The three-switch name is supposed to have come from the fact that the kids there were a bit unruly, and the switch was what you were made to go fetch from the woods when you were bad. You had to pick out your own switch, a green branch, and the leaves were stripped off, and then the teacher whacked you with it. And it was said that the kids at three-switch were so bad they needed 3 switches. And it was also said that sometimes the teacher would have to lock them in the woodshed because they were so awful. But they may have been. But the thing about some of these rural schools is if you had a teacher right out of high school and she was not a very big person and she had 8th grade boys that were 2 heads taller than she was, she might not have any adults that she would see during her day at the school, no backup. She had to do what she had to do to get by, and there are some of those kids were pretty wicked. Locking the teacher away in the woodshed, that kind of thing. And in one case down by Drummond, the teacher was on a swing and they took her and tied her up on the pole on the side of the swing until someone came to rescue her. So it was interesting. So, and the school also served as the polling place and the center of community for events there. And usually there was a Christmas program that everyone came to. And this school was open through the spring of 1925. And when three-switch closed, the kids were able to go to another school that was already in place just a half mile down the road on the corner of Nevers and Patey. And this was called the Progress School. And the building here had been the Long Lake Grange Hall. It had been moved to the site, renovated, partition built down the middle, and a wood stove installed on each side of the partition. So it had 2 classrooms, and this operated as a state graded school. And if you had a state graded school and could operate it to certain guidelines, you would get state aid for your school system. So this was a big deal to try to do this. And that's what Progress was. So a parent-teacher group formed to help with small projects for the school to help fund them. They'd hold fundraisers, and they bought things like a new lunch table for the kids and gas lamps. And they helped with the Christmas program. In the 1930s, though, when money kind of got tight, Progress was turned back into a one-room school with just one teacher. And there was a local resident, Ida Kinsler, who worked here for quite a number of years, for 14. She worked longer in any of the Washburn schools, the rural ones, than anyone else did. When Progress finally closed in 1941, the students were then all transported down to Ondosagon, which was more of a consolidated school. And Ida Kinsler came too, and she worked there for another 22 years. So after that, Progress was used as a community hall and managed by the Progress Club. And they held card parties there and fundraisers for the Red Cross, held classes in home ec and agriculture. And when it disbanded, the building was sold in 1971 for $550. And the Progress Club gave the rest of the money in its accounts to the Bayfield County Hospital. And the last, oops, sorry about that. This is Progress at the end of its life. The roof is gone and the false front there. And this is a list by Ida Kinsler of some of the programs they had at this school one year, and that's from some of the records at the county superintendent's office.
That's our great aunt. My sister and I are here. Ida.
Really? Oh, that's great. That's great. You'll have to tell Ida stories later. Okay, so the next school we're going to talk about is Long Lake. So, oh shoot, there's too many buttons on this thing. So here it was 3 switch. Here's Long Lake School over here, and then we're going to go down to Wilson. So, once again, a lot of kids in this area, so they're building a lot of schools. In 1903, this school was built to serve a lot of Scandinavian families, and the school is located on Wanabo Road. And again, it was not a fancy school here. It was your basic schoolhouse. And it was sometimes called the Prescott School because Martin and Annie Prescott lived nearby, and they often boarded the teacher with them. It was also called the West Branch School because it was near the West Branch of the Sioux River. It never had electricity or a well. Water was hauled from a spring near the river or from Elmer Anderson's nearby farm. And the Mothers Club formed to assist with raising money for the school. They bought things like new linoleum, an oil stove for the corner kitchen, a phonograph, and cod liver oil for the children, which I'm sure they thought was a huge treat. And they also planned end-of-the-year picnics at places like Prentice Park in Ashland and on Madeline Island. And the school is also a place for other groups to meet. One of those was the Morning Star Choral Club, which was a Scandinavian singing group formed with people who lived in the area. And I need to tell you what a treasure you have in Susan Mackrith here, because she has so much experience in working with the Historical Society and the collections, and like people like Catherine Johnson, she has the patience to catalog items in the collection, to understand where they are and help us find them and to take care of them. And she was able to find in the Washburn Area Historical Society collection the Long Lake Birthday Club Ledger, the Morning Star Choral Club Ledger, and the Progress Club Ledger, which were just a ton of fun to take a look through. And this is a page from the Choral Club Ledger. Some of this is written in Norwegian or Swedish, I don't know which, but it talks about how many people were at the meetings and then the places where they performed. And the school, Long Lake School, closed in 1941. It was sold to the Mothers Club and then to the Long Lake Community Club, but eventually fell into disrepair. And David Bratley and I went to see it, and just a few years ago, you could still see the remains of it. And it was sad, but it was fun to find the location. And we'll move along to the Wilson School, which was also in this kind of small neighborhood there. It opened in 1916 and was named after President Woodrow Wilson, another wood frame building, and not very big, really. And once again, no enclosed porches or anything. One of the things we had a lot of fun with during this project was going on field trips to see what we could figure out there in the country. And one summer, David Bratley and I went out to find the Wilson School because it was mislabeled on one map, which really threw us. We were having trouble. And as we were standing on a corner in the middle of nowhere, this pickup truck came by with a fellow in it, and he was very polite, but he wanted to know what the heck we're doing there. And after we told him, he said, "Oh, you need to go talk to my relative Albert Zifko," and took us over to Albert's house nearby. And we spent a couple hours around his kitchen table listening to him tell stories. Albert attended Wilson School in the 1930s. His first teacher was Dorothy Kangas Frostman, and it was her very first teaching job. One thing he recalled about going to school was one of the neighbors had a very mean-tempered bull who would strike fear into the hearts of all the school kids when they had to walk by. It would charge the fence as they went by. So it was fun to talk to him. I was remembered today on the way down, he told lots of stories about hunting and about a very elusive large buck named Old Stoneface. So David and I had a lot of fun finding Wilson School. And another story about Wilson is about Ray Johnson, who grew up in Washburn. That's where her family lived. And her very first teaching job was here at Wilson School, so not too far from the city. She worked there the year 1921-22, and in February, there was a huge snowstorm that affected everyone in the county. Railway was shut down. You couldn't get anywhere. Farmers couldn't take their milk into the dairies. It was horrible. But she wanted to and she boarded with the Ray Bailey family. But she wanted to get home during the storm. So she headed out on her skis to Washburn, and the drifts were as high as the telephone lines, and it was bitterly cold, and she got stuck in a drift, and that could have been the end of Ray Johnson, but Mr. Bailey checked after her and found her, got her back home. Mrs. Bailey gave her a hot toddy, and the next thing Ray knew, it was morning, and she survived that storm. So, like Long Lake and Progress Schools, Wilson eventually closed in 1941, and the kids went down to Andosigan. The schoolhouse was purchased by Arnold Johnson and skidded down Engo Road, and he added a second story and renovated it as a residence. And this is what it looks like today. So it's very fun to go find it. And our next school is Maple Hill, on Maple Hill Road. Cute little building. The lot was purchased from the Froseth family, and the school was originally called Froseth School, and it has that interesting little indented entryway there. It had a number of well-loved teachers there from the area. Julia Bartness was known for how well she coached the spelling bees, and her teams usually won. Wilma Wick joined in with the kids during their recess games. Minnie Hovey expanded the school's music program and accompanied the kids on a reed organ. And Naomi Swanson was known for her beautiful penmanship. And Naomi Swanson's family lived nearby, and her brother Ed Swanson left us a lot of memories of the school because they had a lot of fun social gatherings there. And he said that for parties, there was a kitchen in one corner of the school, and the kids would fetch pails of water for making coffee and washing dishes. At about 9 p.m., cars of partygoers would arrive. Someone would start playing a fiddle or an accordion, and dancing began. They had a great time doing square dances, a broom dance where a broom was passed around as everyone danced to the men. The man who ended up with it, his wife got to go find another partner, and he had to dance with the broom. So that was fun. And there was a Dutch couple in the neighborhood who were really super dancers, and they used to play schottisches for them, and everyone watched. Hot coffee and lunch were served about 11:30 p.m. Then everybody visited, washed the dishes, tidied up the school, and went home. And Ed also recalled that the highlight of the year was the Christmas program, and he remembered his mother spending hours remaking their old clothes so that all of her kids just looked the best they could for that Christmas program. But in the 1930s, families started to move away from that area. No kids were left, and it closed in 1931. It was then used as a garage and repair shop by Sheree Peterson. And now let's look at some of the town of Washburn schools that are out on what has ended up to be County C here. So we'll look at McKinley, and then 4 Mile Creek, and then Canstrom School here. So here's McKinley. It was built in 1905 near the Sioux River, and it was first called the Sioux River School, and eventually McKinley School after the president. Simple wood frame building. It closed for 3 years during the 1930s when money was tight in the district, and finally closed in 1937, but has had a new life. Was deeded to the town of Washburn and used as the town hall. It did get a well in 1993, so no one has to use outhouses there anymore. And it's a lovely building with that landmark plaque on it. And the next one, out County C, is the 4 Mile Creek School. And when you head out that way, you come to a place where Eric and Sophia Westling settled in 1892 along a really beautiful little stream. And they had come here directly from Sweden and first boarded in the city of Washburn here at the Scandia House. And they had a number of hardships. The first thing that happened was Eric was badly burned while working at his first job at a paper mill in Ashland. And they were really helped out by the Swedish Baptist Church until he could work again. But they'd heard about this land outside of Washburn. it was affordable near that nice stream, and it had good access routes from areas where logging railroads had once been and were now removed, so that there were some clearings. And so they bought the 40 acres out there from the Loveland Land Company, and they spent everything they had left in a cow and a Winchester rifle and started building a cabin on their property. The whole family worked really hard on the land. They also built a dam on the creek and a homemade water wheel and a little sawmill. And at one point, they lost their home to fire. They had to rebuild that. But they soon had a lot of neighbors out there, and they improved their sawmill, and they'd cut shingles and sell them to the neighbors. So it was a nice little community developing out there. And thanks to Eric, they put in their own telephone lines and then connected them up with the city system. Most of the settlers were Swedish and Norwegian immigrants, and they really wanted schools for their kids. So the first school met in a local home, and local woman Julia Bartness, who's shown there in her graduation photo from the high school in Washburn, was their teacher, and she went on to have a very long teaching career, and I bet a lot of you know who she is. And the 4 Mile Creek Schoolhouse here was opened in 1902. And you can see here too where the Westling Dam was, and here's the school. After it closed, the school grounds became the site of the Seaside Inn, which I'm sure a lot of you remember. And it's residents there now, and the old school building is the garage at that site. So it's still there. This next school, this Canstrom School, was kind of elusive because Dave Bratley had heard stories about this cabin ruins out on County C, and that it was a school one time. And it took a while to get this all figured out, but the site of this school started out as a homestead bought by William Kelly in 1885, and he built a really crude cabin just to prove it up. And the land was then bought by the Bigelow Lumber Company and logged off, and a railroad built there through to transport the logs. And then the 40 acres, which is right here, was purchased by Gertrude Canstrom, Gertie Canstrom there on the map. She was a Norwegian immigrant, a widow, and had several kids, and she built this cabin, beautiful hand-hewn log cabin, and with an outer layer of shingles, that you can still see there, for insulation, and lived there, and it had a little sleeping loft for the kids up above, but otherwise it was just a one room. In about 1910, a neighbor down here, Mr. Steen, purchased Gertie's property, and he had a bunch of kids. There were a few other kids in the neighborhood, and so for just 1 year, 1913-14, this cabin served as a schoolhouse. Esther Burge was a teacher, and she had to snowshoe in the winter to get to school from the Frank Marion home where she was boarding. After that, the cabin passed through several hands. It was a bachelor pad for a lot of its life, a hunting cabin, and then fell to disrepair, and I think you can probably still see it there if you look along the side of the road. And it's hard to see here, but when we saw it, you could still see the dovetail corners on the logs from that Canstrom school. There's one other school out beyond the Canstrom school that's actually in the town of Bell here. I've added on the town of Bell, and that is the Golden Prairie School. And as time went on, County C became improved, and it goes, of course, all the way to Cornucopia. And there's even one more school along the way, the Siskowitz School out here. But we'll talk about the Golden Prairie. The site of Golden Prairie is pretty much in what we call the Barrens, that really sandy area that reaches from this part of the county down to the southwest. And sandy, hard to farm, but beautiful, and a great place for blueberries. So in 1906, they hired Hans Swanby to actually improve this road that was heading up towards Cornucopia. So it kept getting better and better. People were trying to farm out there, and there were, a few families living in the area. But in 1906, there were enough kids that they opened the Golden Prairie School right here. It was also called the Prairie School or the Number 3 School. One of the teachers was Mrs. Charles Smith. They lived right here. And another teacher was Fern Purley, and her family lived right there. And Fern, who is shown in the photo there, also later taught up at that Siskowitz school further up the road. And that was the Russian settlement where a number of really, really poor Russian families came to settle, and they worked so hard. And they used to say the time they lived there was the potato years. All they had was potatoes, and they had a little log school. But we have some memories about Fern Purley when she was there from Helen Shuga, who attended Siskowitz School. And she remembered, she loved Fern Purley. She brought law and order and magic into our midst, and we grew to love her. She read the first poetry I ever heard. It was and still is enchanting to me. And if you can imagine some little kid out in that Russian settlement learning this, what a lifelong impression it would make. But people soon moved away from that Golden Prairie School area. The school closed in 1913, but there's a place along there where the Purley family lived that was called Purley Flats, and I don't know if any of you have heard of it, but people loved to pick blueberries out there, and they liked it because it was wide open. They couldn't lose the kids because they could always see them. I've always wanted to go out there and check that out. And now we're going to look at a few schools that are a little further north into what is today the town of Bayview. When some of these schools started, this was still under the town of Washburn. The Bayview didn't get set aside till 1913. So we're going to look at Houghton School, Roosevelt, and Finn School, also called Gibson School. So by the 1880s, the Houghton site along the shoreline here had developed into a big quarrying area, and I'm sure you've all kind of learned about that. But there were 3 big quarries there, and there were up to like 250 people living there. The quarries were shipping out blocks of stone there on the waterfront. There was a sawmill, there were stores, and they had an operating school. We don't know quite when it opened, but it was open in the 1880s. When the Frostman family, who were Norwegian immigrants, came and settled in Houghton, their son Helmer remembers he entered school in 1892. The teacher referred to him and the other new students as greenhorns, and he did not appreciate that. But the second year he was there, they built this new school building, this 2-story building with this great bell tower. It was a really nice building. They didn't finish the second floor at first, waited a couple years, but then when they did, they added a second teacher. So it was a graded school. They also had a lot of benefits and things here too. And Helmer said the first benefit they had in that school was to raise money for workers at the quarries who had been injured. And they also had dances. The Houghton Band played for a lot of these. And those Frostman kids were pretty memorable too. There were quite a few of them in the family. And no one forgot the day that little Bobby Frostman rescued a skunk from a trap on the way to school through the woods. His teacher immediately sent him home, but that smell lingered throughout the day. School. After graduating from 8th grade there, he graduated from high school in Washburn. He taught at rural town of Ulu schools for 19 years, and then he served as county sheriff for 14 years, and he caught a lot of the bootleggers during his day. So the school had a lot of kids, but then the population dropped really suddenly as the quarry industry faded away. It went back to being a one-room school, and then it served as a town hall for a time. Finally closed in 1938, and the kids in that area were transported into Washburn for school, and the building's still there on the Bodine land, and Beta told me that they've started cleaning it out and fixing it up a little bit, so very cool. And here's a Roosevelt School. It was opened in 1908 at what today is the intersection of Mackey and Komborski roads. And many young women who lived in the area taught there. There were two young sisters, Laura and Alma Hagen, sisters Hazel and Nora Thorson. They also taught there for several years. Their dad was Norwegian and he farmed nearby. Betsy Wick was from a Norwegian family, and they farmed between the Onion and Sioux rivers. She taught there for several years. And the school was actually located on the corner of the Wick property here, or the Legacy, Peter Legacy farm property. Here's their home. They had come here from Canada, and their daughter Mary taught at the school. And Roosevelt School closed in 1938. The building was used as a town hall, but finally torn down in 1974 when a new town hall was built.
Parts of that building is in my yard at my garage.
Really? Okay.
Bid $50 on it, had to have it down in a month.
Oh,
My dad built me a garage, 2-story.
oh wow. These things live on, but it's fun to know what has happened to them all. And here we've got the Finn School. In 1904, there were some Finnish immigrants, John Nimisto, Matty Bakala, and Matty Hekla, and they each bought 40 acres north of Washburn. And they moved here with their families and all their belongings loaded into a train boxcar, and that included the Nimisto's cow. And they worked hard together to start their farms. They barely had a trail up to their land when they started out. But more Finnish families joined them in what became called the Finn Settlement at the corner of Big Rock and Friendly Valley roads. In 1906, a school was first opened for the kids there in a home. Elmy Gibson was the teacher, and the school was first called Gibson School. And then this schoolhouse was built and opened in 1907 and called the Finn School. They also built a Finnish workers' hall in the 1920s. And as opposed to the school, the workers' hall actually served more as a community center. And they enjoyed wedding dances, parties, youth programs, and as true Finns, they loved to ski and go sliding in the winter. The school was closed in 1937, and then the kids attended other schools. The building was then used on the Hugo and Hazel Mackey farm as a barn. And today you can go and see this marker marking the Finn settlement there. So what was it like inside these schools? Truly the heart of the school was that wood stove. They all had one. They were usually jacketed. They had an outer, kind of like a cage or whatever, so kids didn't get burned quite as easily. But they required wood. If you didn't have an attached woodshed, somebody had to go out and bring in wood every day. But if you can imagine arriving on a cold morning like this, often the teacher's job was to start that stove and get it going. But it took a couple hours, and the kids often did calisthenics and things for a while until it really warmed up in there. But that was their heat. It also helped thaw out their lunches when it was time for them, and it dried out their mittens and wet clothing when needed. So it was just an important part of the school. And eventually jobs like hauling wood or hauling water to the school from a nearby neighbor or a stream were jobs that were contracted out. Sometimes it was an adult in the community that got them, but often it was a child. And can you imagine coming every day early to school and hauling a bucket of water from a farm a mile away to the school? But for these kids, they would get paid like $1 a month. Some of them, it bought them their first nice dress. For others, it was cash money they could take home to their families who did not have cash. They were farming and, they just didn't have it, so it was very important. Another job was sweeping the floors every day. And these desks were often 4 or 6 of them were screwed to 2 long boards so that they were in a row. So when you swept the floor, you could move like 4 at a time by just moving a row of those desks. So somebody got that job. And you probably know, at my house right now, I have static in my hair. These schools in winter were full of static and dust in the air from sweeping. So, by the 1910s, the superintendent was saying, you keep a kettle of water on that stove so you're moisturizing the air. It helped with the kids getting sick and all sorts of things. So, the other thing in the schools, there was usually always a nice clock on the wall, a globe, maybe a map of Wisconsin, and then of course a water bucket. In the early times, everybody shared a dipper into the water bucket for drinking. Later on, there were dispensers and cups for the kids to use. And did anyone learn how to write in script using the Palmer method? Because usually somebody has. This was how you learned this scientific method for holding your pen properly, good posture, and these rote exercises that the kids would do for hours. And a lot of them had developed really beautiful handwriting. Of course, today, kids can't even read script, and we've learned a lot about how this sort of training develops your mind and your hand-eye coordination and is really pretty valuable. But everybody worked on the Palmer method. The other thing that went on every year was the annual spelling bee. It was called the State Fair Spelling Bee. Kids from nearby schools would all compete with each other. The winners would go on to compete with kids from other towns. And finally, there was a winner from the county. That person won a trip down to the State Fair in Milwaukee, and it was a big deal. And here are some of the kids who won their area spelling bees one year. You can also see too, nice American flag in that room and things written on the blackboard here. And recess was also an important part of the kids' day and having lunches. Here's a group down in Barnes at the Peace School having their lunch. And kids in early times brought their lunches, whatever they had. They often brought them in a lard pail. And Susan Mackrith found this great Tetzner's lard bucket in the Washburn collection. And my original hope for the title of the book would be Lunch in a Lard Pail, but I had to change my mind after a while. The other pail that kids mentioned using in the county, and this was during the Depression, was red hen jelly pails. And I looked up to see what they were like and a little bit more about them. It was during the Depression, and this red hen jelly was basically, it contained no fruit at all. I don't know what it was in it, but it must have been horrible stuff. But it provided good pails for lunches. Eventually, though, the school started to provide hot lunches, and they had those little corner kitchens and would then even hire someone to make lunches. And of course, no one could ever forget the outhouse. All the schools had them, usually one for boys, one for girls. This is from Millie Olson, who went to Longview School down by Drummond. A trip to the outhouse wasn't bad in spring or fall, but winters were awful. No one shoveled the trail, so a trip was only made when one was desperate. Sometimes we had to wade in snow up to our waists. If you fell off the pack trail, you were in trouble. And this is actually the outhouse that still stands behind the Kelly School down in the town of Kelly. The school building is now their town hall, but the outhouse is still out there. And recess was a time for fun. These kids didn't mind winter. They skied, they built ski jumps by their schools. And down in the more wooded areas, more than one group of kids would play logging camp at recess time. And in winter, they'd build a fire to cook their lunches on, maybe warm them up. And they would dam up, pile up logs on a frozen stream. And then in spring, they'd wait for everything to thaw out and the log pile to go. And they had a super time doing that. And many of these kids would go by a logging camp on the way to or from school. Logging camps loved kids to stop in. They'd feed them cookies and pie, and they just loved seeing these kids. And skiing was a big deal. And, you know, on the way to school, a lot of these kids, you know, when they walked, the boys had trap lines that they set along the way, and they would check them. When they first rode in these little covered wagons, horse-drawn, the kids would often jump out and run alongside and pick flowers and play. But they had a good time on the way to school. And some rode their family horses. Some had their dog sleds. And we're going to look at just a couple schools here to the south of Washburn in the town of Barksdale. The first one we'll look at here is Engo School, so not too far south. And then we're going to jump down and look at some schools in the Barrens, the Tokay School, Ottman, and the Field School. And of course, you know, people went out to the Barrens, they thought they were going to be able to live there and farm, and it was tough going. So here's the Engo School. Hans and Helga Engo were Norwegian immigrants, and they settled along a rail line that went into Washburn here. And it was in kind of the headwaters of Bono Creek there, and they settled in the mid-1880s, so pretty early on. And they made the most of that site and developed a little train stop on their property. They had a small store, they served snacks and coffee. Hans invested in more real estate, and then he would sell it to people who wanted to settle in the area. And they operated the post office out of there. And it was a really popular spot for workers on the rail line and the passengers. And a school first opened out of the Engo home in 1893. And then finally a schoolhouse was built on their property. And I've never come across a photo of that. But this became known as the Engo Settlement. They had an Engo social club. They'd meet weekly for visiting and singing and coffee. And this site flourished for about 30 years. In the meantime, just to the south here, the Barksdale DuPont plant was developed. And this is This is one of those 1938 aerial photographs that just are amazing to look at here. So the area really changed during the years that the Engos were there. But with the passing of the railroads, the community and the population just kind of fell off by the Engos, and the school closed in 1918. So let's go out to the Barrens now. And the one thing that the Barrens were really great for was blueberries, because they loved the conditions out there. And so picking blueberries was a really big deal. There's some of the Barren families out, in midsummer picking the berries. They also were joined by a lot of Ojibwe folks who traditionally picked berries. People would dry berries or can them for their own use, or they could send them by train into places like Ashland to the markets and make a little bit of money. So down there in the town of Barksdale in 1911, there was a group of Hungarian immigrants. They had first come through Pennsylvania, but they came out here. They wanted to buy land, and they hoped to grow grapes. So they were just kind of to the west of the DuPont factory. A school was built for their children and operated just for a few years from 1912 to 1918. And the school was named Tokay School. And Tokay is a famous grape growing area in Hungary. It was also called Barony School because the Barony folks lived here. It's misspelled as Barney here, but that's where the Baronies were, and here was the school on part of their land. So a very short-lived school. The Hungarians gave up trying to live on the Barrens, as most people did. But the house, we don't have a picture of it, the school as a school, but the building was moved to Range Road and remodeled and is a private residence now. And a little further to the west, there were 3 Ottman families who bought land. There were a few other people out there, but they had hoped to farm. Here's where the school was built for the Ottmans. And on this map, you can see that it's a square, but it's not a solid square. That's because at the time it was an abandoned school, but it was located on the Ashland Trail, which would have taken them into Ashland. The schools, again, served families from just 1916 to 18. Again, the Barrens won, the families moved away. And then a bit further out is the Field School. And several families took up small homesteads out in this area. The Christfield family had several kids on a little farm, and then the Francisek Polkowski family had several boys and girls nearby. And joining them later was the Frank Barabee family, and they took over a friend's homestead and then built a nice cabin for themselves. Well, once again, farming was terrible out here, but they picked berries, they fished at nearby Bladder Lake, and there was a lot of venison available, and it was beautiful. Everyone who lived in the Barrens said it was beautiful. They just couldn't survive there. And if you went 3 miles south from where these folks lived, you could catch the Northern Pacific train into Ashland for supplies. And it was a very interesting neighborhood because there were also a lot of old retired bachelor loggers who lived in old logging camp buildings. There were a few African American families who had worked with the railroads, and they would get together, people would visit and have parties and play music. So they built a school for the kids there. It was called Field School after the Field family, but it was also called Bladder Lake School because it was nearby. Again, only operated from 1916 to 1924. And we had the draft done for this book. We were ready to say print. And a guy named Jed Jaworski walked into the museum in Iron River one day. And he was a descendant of the Field family. And he said, do you know where this school is? I've got pictures. Well, everything we know about Bladder Lake Field School now is from Jed. He had these amazing pictures of the inside of the school, the outside. This is one of the teachers and two of the field kids. And this wonderful panoramic view of where the families live. This is down in a little valley. It was amazing. So we updated our draft and then we printed the book. But David Bratley and I, of course, had said, oh yeah, he knew where it was. We could figure it out. We could go there. And he said, you know, you can see the foundation for the school. So we went, and I mean, when you get there, it just looks completely wild. But this is the same view of this little valley here. The school was like over here. Here's the school here. This is David standing in the middle of the school foundation. This is the big base that would have been under the wood stove at the center of the school. I'm not sure what David's doing with that stick, but he was having fun. So it was very cool. We've been there 2 times now, and it's just pretty amazing. But again, people couldn't live out there. They moved away. Most of the school sites that are in the Barrens, people lost to back taxes during the 30s, and they're mostly all in the Chequamegon National Forest today. And our last school that is in the Barrens, but a little further north in the western part of Washburn County, is Arbutus School. Again, just a few families out here. After Field School closed, that Bearby family moved over and went to Arbutus School. And it is a very remote spot. And you can also see, here's the school, abandoned at the time on the map, but there was the Washburn Iron River Trail that went by it. But on July 16th in 1926, there were a couple of families out picking blueberries near the school. They had a base camp out there. They're the Reby and Sesky families, and they had wandered over towards the school. They were going to camp there overnight, and the school was kept open so people could do that during blueberry picking time. All of a sudden, the wind came up, and they took cover. A horrible, horrible wind went through. And what had happened is a severe tornado went through Bayfield County from up by Port Wing down to the southeast through the town of Eileen. 2 young women were killed down there. One of them was a teacher. But when the families picking blueberries stood up after this had gone through, the school was gone. The only thing left was the floor. Everything else was gone, and it had torn off the canvas covers on their vehicles that they had driven into the site. So Arbutus was never rebuilt. The town got $2,100 for the loss of the building and the contents, but you can still see the arbutus flowers blooming in the spring there that the school is named after. So what's the legacy of these one-room schools? You know, I've talked to a lot of people who went to them, and they loved the education that they got there, and it set them on a path to do amazing things and have amazing careers. But they loved the part where kids of various ages were in the same classroom. They learned from each other, and if you missed something one year, well, the kids behind you were going to do it again. You might have to be able to pick things up. They cooperated. Their school was the center of their little community, and they often had very caring teachers. So, you know, even though it was a simple situation, kids got the basics in those schools. The one downside, though, is that when you read the school census records from some of these communities, you often see families who had children who had a handicap or maybe couldn't fit into that one-room school situation. Sometimes those kids got no education. Sometimes they were sent to the state school for the deaf, if that was a problem. But, you know, it just didn't serve everyone. And this kind of shows how the schools sprung up from 1890 to 1920. They started, each dot is a school. So they started up on the coast by Washburn and Bayfield, and then down through the state following the rail lines and logging areas. And then they just start to spread all over. By 1920, it's kind of our peak of schools. But they didn't last forever. That was a lot of schools to operate. Some areas were losing population. It cost a lot to run these little schools. And a lot of times, as the field of education improved and advanced, schools were required to teach more and more varied subjects to kids to provide better, safer, healthier buildings, and transportation got better. We had our early mechanized vehicles. They were often homemade jobs, were pretty interesting. But schools started to consolidate, and it's mostly because of the money, but people really didn't want to lose their local school because it was the center of community. It was a hard thing, and a lot of communities fought it. But Bayfield County has the honor of being the site of the first consolidated school in the state, and that's the Port Wing School, opened in 1903. And out front here, there are teams of horses and wagons, because they decided it was better to pay to transport all of their kids to one school in the village there than to operate 5 rural schools. So that's what they did. And the county superintendent of schools at the time, Jessie Smith, while she was a great superintendent, she fought consolidation, and that was why she eventually was beat out in the county election by a more progressive woman. And then our other consolidated school, of course, was Ondossigan. And this kind of shows the number of schools operating over time. So you can see they really peaked here in 1920 and then start to become reduced here. Our last one-room school in Bayfield County closed in 1968, and that was the Namacoggin School down in town in Namacoggin. And today, we have just 6 school districts in our county. Bayfield, Washburn, South Shore, Drummond, and then 2 districts that actually center in other counties, Ashland and the Maple District. So that's a huge change, and a lot of kids are transported a long way to school. And if you would like to see some of our surviving schoolhouses, though, this is the Fairview School. It's now been relocated at the Ulu Cultural Center over in Ulu, and it's completely furnished inside, so you can go there and see if you can fit into one of those little desks. But they have a summer school there, and the kids love that building. And down in the town of Barnes, this building was moved to the Barnes Area Historical Association's complex of buildings. It served as 2 different schools, the O'Neill School and then later the Pease School. And so it's been renovated now, and they're working to do some more interpretation on that. And one of our really cool log school buildings, the Raspberry School, that was up in the town of Russell in the 70s, was moved down to Old World, Wisconsin, and Eagle, Wisconsin, and is used for interpretation. And it looks pretty cool. Thank you for being a really super patient audience tonight and for coming out when it's so cold. And we'll open it up for questions. I think Ginny has a microphone
I
here.
have, and so if somebody has something they want to add. Also, I want to remind Sheree, if she's got a copy of the actual book, and I think it's impressive just to see.
Yeah, if anyone wants to take a look, and I also have order sheets, or I have a couple extra copies with me too, so.
Yep. Any questions or comments to add?
Excuse me, the tornado that you talked about, the Reeves and the Seskies?
Yeah.
The Reeves were my grandparents.
Oh my
I remember
gosh.
them talking about it.
Wow.
Yeah.
It was quite a thing. It actually tore the feathers off of chickens on some of the farms. It was, you know, and we don't get these kinds of things up here.
The straw was driven into trees.
I remember reading about that. Yeah, you were saying that a straw was driven into a tree. But the death of those two young women was very sad. Yeah.
Any more? All right. Well, I want to thank everybody again for coming out. The next one will be in 2 weeks.